It's not a super tightly scripted talk. I mean, I have given that kind of talk. It's on a very tight time frame. This one is a little bit looser, so if it's okay with you, it'll be a little bit more of a kind of workshop atmosphere. And I do encourage you to, break in, raise questions along the way, rather than feeling like you have to wait till the end. So hopefully we'll have good discussions during the talk, or definitely afterwards. So this is an image, or many images of the sun. This one comes from the Babylonian Jewelry Museum, which sort of tells the story of Jewish people in Babylon and present-day Iraq. This is the psalm I realize not everyone has all the psalms committed to memory. So this is the psalm in the King James language, which is kind of ubiquitous in the English-speaking world. And so you find this language turning up in lots of musical versions. So it's a 9-verse psalm from the Hebrew Bible. It's unique in that it's the only psalm that's set in a particular time and place. So it begins with the images of these Judean captives languishing beside the river. A lot of debate about what kind of a psalm it is, and there are a variety of different psalm genres. This one doesn't fit neatly into any particular psalm. It's certainly got elements of a lament, but people make arguments for other genres as well. But it sort of defies classification. Notice that the 3 sections, and I've broken up the psalm today and in the book into 3 sections. So the first 4 verses, the first section, you can see that they move from the past and the collective, we, to the middle 2 verses in the present tense, a kind of conditional. If this, then that, consequence. And then finally, prophecies of future vengeance against Babylon and Edom. So what can be said about the psalm as a Hebrew poem? I don't know Hebrew, so I have to depend on the kindness of Hebrew Bible scholars. But I can play a little sample of the psalm in Hebrew from a reading actually made by MSU's own John Eulenberg from the Artificial Language Lab, who kind of worked with me and was willing to record the psalm for me, apparently in a pretty strong American Hebrew accent. But anyway, you get a little sense. The psalm has a lot of alliteration and assonance, sort of evoking a mournful tone, repeated occurrence of the labials B and M, which some would say simulate the sound of wind in willows over waters. Anyway, here's the opening verse.
Al nacharot Babel, sham yashavnu, gam bachinu, v'zochrenu et Zion.
So that's the music of the psalm in Hebrew, and I'll be talking a lot about, obviously, other musical settings. There's a lot that can be done in terms of parsing the psalm, and there's a scholar, Friedman, David Noel Friedman, who's broken it down, very careful parsing of the syllables in Hebrew, counting the number of syllables, and he kind of sets it up. He argues that it's got this envelope construction with these various shells narrowing down into the core, the nucleus at the center of the poem, which are verses 5 and 6. And I think it's an interesting way of sort of framing it and pointing out the symmetry. But there's also thematic symmetries as well. The psalm begins and ends with Babylon. First, the watery Babylon of the river, and then second, the dry rock. It features lines of direct speech at the beginning from the Babylonians are quoted. At the end, it's the Edom's sons. And there's lots of oppositions in the psalm between Babylon and Jerusalem, river and rock, silence and singing, and a big one, forgetting and remembering. And I won't go into it here, but Friedman actually sees these symmetries throughout, sees the whole Hebrew Bible as a kind of symmetrical structure. And again, I noticed that the story of the Babylonian captivity really fits at exactly the nucleus of that as well, which he says falls between the end of the histories and the beginning of the latter prophets, right? So end of Chronicles. So it's kind of interesting to think of this psalm and the situation it depicts as being at the very core, the nucleus of the Hebrew Bible. And I make another argument about it, which is that the psalm, in effect, leads us through the steps of coming to terms with trauma or grief. First, there's this, the psalmist confronts the disbelief, the disorientation and sadness of the exile. Then there's a kind of inward turn, a decision to remain committed to one's calling and one's community in the face of adversity. And then finally, this blast of violence and rage, a kind of call to action at the end. So these are all very common human experiences to collective suffering entailed by trauma, such as forced migration. Not necessarily sequential. I'm not arguing that these are like the stages of suffering, but I mean, I think they intermingle. But taken together, they might constitute a kind of natural process. So I organized the book in 3 sections. The first part I call History. I was inspired by Paul Ricoeur's great work called History, Memory, Forgetting, or Memory, History, Forgetting. So notice the opening section, the sorrowful mood, first-person plural mode of address. And the 4th verse is a kind of hinge, right? It completes the opening image, but it also leads into the middle section, which can be taken as a kind of answer to the question, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So I am a historian, basically a kind of social cultural historian, and so all along I thought, well, I'd really like to know more about the context in Babylon and Judah during this time period, and very naively thinking, well, someone's undoubtedly done a little work on what was happening on the ground. Because, the Bible doesn't really tell much at all. It's a kind of a gap or a black hole, frankly. And so, I was always curious, and that's one of the reasons I call this book, the enduring mystery of the psalm. What was actually happening? How did this psalm come to be? And so I did a lot of research by Hebrew Bible scholars, and it turns out there's a whole voluminous literature on what's going on in Babylon, what's going on in Judah during this time period. And it's really impressive work of working with the tiniest little shreds of textual or archaeological evidence and spitting out all these findings and conjectures. So I was also intrigued throughout by thinking about the exile in relation to the Exodus as two of the sort of core incidents at the heart of Judaism. Many would say that the experience of the Babylonian exile was a kind of crucible in the formation of Judaism, in that it forced the Israelites to rethink their relationship to Yahweh. It revised their understanding of the covenant. It caused them to reassess their status as a chosen people, and it was a situation for a rewriting of their sacred history. The Babylonian exile inaugurated the Israelite sense of themselves as a nation of exile, a people who somehow have survived living in diaspora for some 2,500 years. So I won't go into the literature of Judah and Babylon, sometimes called Gola, except to say there's a lot of interest in sort of correcting assumptions and myths about what was happening in the two regions. So Judah, the region where the captives, the exiles, were removed from, and it's long thought that really there was nothing going on there, that all the action moved up to Babylon because a group of captives moved there. But there's been a lot of interest in trying to figure out what happened to the people left behind, which was basically the so-called people of the land. It was really only the elites that were transported to Babylon. So a lot of research and finding that actually there's a lot more continuity in Judah than had previously been thought. It was not a kind of total trauma that wiped out all social and cultural activity. And then the other group of scholarship has focused on what's happening to the northeast in Babylon, the irrigation canals, and so forth. Here's the history, just to paint in very broad strokes what's happening over the course of this millennium, from King David's ascendance, unifying the northern and southern kingdoms, various conquests by Assyrians and then Babylonians. You can see there are 3 waves of deportation, so it wasn't just one exile. And then the beginnings, the return of many of the exiles, and of course some stayed in Babylon, and there's a lot of interest, curiosity about, who stayed behind, why did they stay, or why would they return? And then the beginning of Roman rule and destruction of the Second Temple. This is a map, which I hadn't really thought about thinking of how this migration would flow. I'd somehow pictured just the direct line as the crow flies, but obviously that wouldn't make sense to cross all that desert. So it's thought that the exiles moved up north and then followed the Euphrates down. And then there are a number of settlements along the Euphrates there where the captives were held. So scholarly opinion has shifted back and forth between thinking that this exile experience was relatively benign, that the Judeans were treated quite well in Babylon, and there is some evidence for that, but then more recent work by people working in fields like refugee studies, migration studies, trauma theory, saying no, even under the best conditions, this exile would have been a highly traumatic experience. There's no way you can say, people just picked up and moved and carried on. And then lately, really interesting discoveries in the cuneiform, which is a big source of material outside the Hebrew Bible for what was going on in this period. And cuneiform tablets that indicate that there were stable communities of Judeans in Babylon during this entire period. In fact, one settlement that was actually called Judahtown, and that they had assimilated pretty well into society and into the economy. So I think there's lots of different evidence about the lived experience of these captives. So here's another map. This is a Babylonian map of the world, which is a little hard to follow. But this line here is apparently the Euphrates River is circled. So Babylon is encircled by this river called the Bitter River, and supposedly the city itself is over here in this region. So this is an example of the kind of cuneiform that the tablet that scholars draw on to sort of confirm or challenge some of the evidence that's found in the Bible. I was really struck by the new techniques being brought to bear in this period, including analysis of climate change, right, and how this might have affected Babylonian policy, and this was really interesting to me. A lot of attention also on generations and sort of analyzing the exile experience in terms of generations and how it would have been a very different experience, obviously, for the first generation as opposed to children and others. And so you can apply that to the psalm and think, well, this part of the psalm seems to be reflecting a different generational perspective than other parts. So this sets up an interesting tension between memory as sacred history, as narrated by the Hebrew Bible, and professional historiography, painstakingly assembled by scholars using the latest methodologies. So what happens to the meaning of the exile when we historicize the very period during which so much of the history of Israel was being inscribed and redacted by the Judeans who were themselves in exile. Now, just a couple of musical examples, and obviously jumping ahead quite a bit, but just ways in which that opening tableau along the river has been set to music. This is one I learned fairly late in the research game, so I don't have that much to say about it, but it's an interesting story. One of Verdi's, really the early opera that in effect put him on the map in opera circles was his telling of the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians and the Hebrew, as they're called, Hebrew captives. And a lot of interest in this opera because it was his first, and interest in whether this was an expression of Italian nationalism, that he was sort of retelling this story as a way to join the upsurge of nationalism and sort of national determination that was underway in Italy at that time. But it turns out the play was recently staged. I haven't seen it yet. Oh, I'm not getting the internet here. I should have. Okay. That's okay. Well, there's a scene from the Pittsburgh Opera production, and the chorus, called the Chorus of the Hebrew Slaves, one of the favorite choruses by Verdi, which has become a sort of Italian national song, and it very stirs Italian listeners very, very deeply. I'll try to get that later if I can get wired in to the internet. Now here's one we don't need the internet for. They're jumping ahead to Godspell, written by Stephen Schwartz, and there's a song in there called On the Willows, which is the only part of the entire musical which is not taken directly from the Gospel of Matthew and the Book of Common Prayer. So it's kind of interesting. In the film and in the play, it's sung after the Last Supper, which is actually a Passover Seder, and in the film it's spoken in Hebrew, and this is where Jesus blesses the disciples towards the end of the film then. Many versions in classical music and popular music. As you would imagine, those first four verses of the psalm, the ones that have really been set to music by far the most. But we'll move now into the second section of the psalm, which, as I've said, there's a kind of bridge from created by verse 4, the shift from the communal voice to the first person singular. So these sort of striking penalties for unfaithfulness to Jerusalem, loss of manual dexterity in the right hand, loss of faculty of speech or song, which suggests to some readers that the speaker here is a musician, possibly a Levite, one of the Jerusalem temple musicians, because these penalties would have hit especially hard. And there's an interesting interpretation in the Midrash about these verses, claiming that the musicians in the psalm actually mutilated their thumbs with their teeth so as to be unable to perform the songs for their captors. So we can read the section as continuing the perspective of those musicians who hung up their harps in verse 2 and hesitated to sing in verse 4. Now, this section, and this is part 2 of the book, is all about memory, and I kind of explore memory in different ways. The scholar Yosef Yerushalmi has written a lot about memory in the Hebrew Bible, and counts something like 169 injunctions to remember. So this word zakar is used repeatedly. So remember, and the converse, do not forget. So this is a very strong trope in the Hebrew Bible. And so this is a theme, obviously, throughout Jewish history. Now, I'll come back to that later in part 3. But I was sort of interested in these middle verses, which have been especially important for those committed to political and social movements, right? So they've really played a strong role, not so much in music, but in political action. And so, for example, this sort of unlikely composer, fascinating composer, really America's first homegrown composer, William Billings, lived at the time of the Revolution, totally self-taught musician, and wrote these phenomenal choral works, and was an interesting character in other ways. He was a strong patriot. He was living in the Boston of Paul Revere, Samuel Adams. Paul Revere actually inscribed the frontispiece for his collection. So, a strong patriot, wrote a number of his anthems and songs to kind of support the cause of independence. And he did this really interesting anthem, Lamentation Over Boston, which is, this is the kind of move that you see lots of activists making with the psalm, transporting it to New England. So obviously the British become Babylon, the oppressive power. But he's very strong on these sanctions. If we forget, or if we lose our loyalty, may these horrible things happen. Which, as you can imagine, for a musician and composer, these are terrible consequences. And I was able to get a group of singers up in New Haven I hadn't heard the piece before. It's not really sung much at all, so I was really curious to how it sounded. So I was able to get them to sing it. And so this is what it sounds like in a very rough shape note sung version.
I recognize your voice.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the one that was slightly out of tune.
You have a range, I think.
Yeah, so that was kind of fun to do. And so, being an Americanist, really an American studies person, my initial research really focused on American settings and sort of uses of the psalm in American history. So you get these shape note versions. So it's a theme that is coming up. Now this is a recent one. This is a really interesting piece by a living composer, and this is a very traditional singing practice. So people are really drawn to the early songs of the 18th, 19th centuries. But this is a song based on Psalm 137 that has become one of the most popular in the Sacred Harp. And I've actually sung it a number of times with the composer. She lives in Chicago, and I was able to interview her for the book about how she happened to write this song. So it's really passed into the canon, and I think a lot of, quite a few people would probably say it might be their favorite song in the book, or certainly their favorite song from maybe the last century. So here's what this one sounds like. So turning to reinterpretations or usages, adaptations of the psalm in North America, Frederick Douglass is an important figure for the way he uses Psalm 137 in what's probably his most famous speech. And so in a sense he's making this similar kind of move as Billings did, using this psalm for the purpose of social justice and liberation. And he's really the first to shift America, the United States, into the role of Babylon. So obviously Billings is seeing Britain as Babylon, the colonies as Judah. So Douglass is the first one to say, wait a second, maybe the United States is Babylon, right? And so he delivers this speech in Rochester. Great speech, drawing this analogy. He's there speaking on the 4th of July, the great irony of this. And so he's asking rhetorically, do you mean to mock me by asking me to speak? If so, there's a parallel. And the parallel is the mocking of the Judeans. And so he cites directly from Psalm 137, the central verses. So this line of argument, this rhetorical use, is taken up by other preachers, political leaders, musicians. So Roland Hayes, a really interesting pioneering African-American singer who really, I would describe him as sort of the Jackie Robinson of African art music. So he becomes this renowned singer, sings all across Europe in the most prestigious concert halls. Of course has troubles back in the States on account of race. And he has an impact on Sterling Brown, one of the really important literary figures of the Harlem Renaissance, or sometimes called the New Negro movement, came out of Washington, D.C. And Sterling Brown's first publication is a short piece he wrote about seeing Roland Hayes seeing a recital at a segregated, at a gymnasium in Washington, D.C., a basketball court, or an old hall with hoops at either end. So there were whites and blacks there, but they were seated separately. And so he has some really interesting observations about the two races responding to this powerful performance. Quote, the whites start at the wild summoning of beautiful distress. Why is there arranging of them in a cantor's song sung by a Negro? What histrionic ability in this man to so feign passionate despair? And then looking at the African Americans, the Negroes brood, are stirred by something deep within, something as far away as all antiquity, as old as human wrong, as tragical as loss of worlds. What does he mean, and why are we all so stirred? So that's his first publication, and he goes on to have a great great career in letters. An influence on Paul Robeson, who's very influenced by the example of Roland Hayes and kind of models his career after Hayes, sings concert spirituals across Europe, and even hires Roland Hayes' pianist to accompany him. So Robeson himself was, decades later, asked to sing the same setting, which was by the Czech composer Dvorak. And so this is what that one sounds like. And so Dvorak had a really interesting relationship to American music, but this is his take on the song. Okay, so that great bass voice. And in an article he wrote for Jewish Life magazine, he closed the circle between Frederick Douglass and Dvorak, and he wrote, this is Robeson, Dvorak, who, quote, came to our country, studied the melodies and lyrics of Negro song, and drew upon its richness for his own creations. And so, in this way, the words of this very song must have traveled back across the ocean with him. And I am told the song was especially popular among the Czech people during their years of suffering under the terror of Nazi occupation. But history moves on, Robeson wrote. Hitler is gone, Prague lives and builds in a new people's democracy. And now I, an American Negro, sing for her this ancient Hebrew song in the language of the people of Huss and Dvorak, Fuchik, and Gottwald. The psalm comes into the repertoire of black preachers. C.L. Franklin, arguably the most famous, or one of the most famous of the 20th century, established the New Bethel Church in Detroit, where Aretha grew up, and lots of interesting, important things happened in the 1950s and 60s. And he became nationally known as a preacher. His sermons were broadcast on radio and recorded and sold commercially. Really a great preacher. Was supposedly Martin Luther King's favorite preacher. So he tackled this psalm in the 1950s, and this was recorded commercially. And he takes the line, well, the Babylonians asked the Hebrews to sing because their music was something unique, thinking the request a bit disorderly and out of place. They refused. But they were wrong, according to Franklin. They should have sung, and this is the argument he makes. So he offers, this singing is a kind of metaphor of Christian testimony, but also racial pride.